Did you know that the book Lolita was based on a real case? In 1948, this girl, Sally Horner, was 10 years old, and she was caught stealing a notebook from a drugstore by a man named Frank LaSalle. LaSalle told her he was an undercover FBI agent and that if she didn't check in with him regularly from here on out, she would be sent to reform school. Being 10 years old, she believed him, and after a few weeks of these check-ins, he abducted her. Frank LaSalle had a long history of crimes against children already, and he spent the next 2 years taking Sally Horner all over the United States and forcing her to pose as his daughter.
Chandler Morrison's debut novel, Dead Inside, follows an unnamed hospital night guard who is a necrophiliac who only keeps his job for the chance to indulge in his sick desires. One shift, he runs into another, even stranger character, a maternity doctor who enjoys eating fetuses. Known as part of the Splatterpunk genre, which is defined by Oxford Language as being characterized by the explicit depiction of horrific, violent, or pornographic scenes. The book has several explicit scenes of necrophilia, fetus eating, and general over-description of grisly scenes. In one word, shocking. The whole point of the book is to be over the top, to disgust you and to horrify you. Obscenity is needed to achieve those goals. After all, who doesn't feel uncomfortable when they read through chapter 1 and stumble across this passage? Why are you naked? That's the only question I'm able to force past my lips, despite the existence of other, more obvious inquiries, like, why are you eating that dead baby? Or, what the fuck is going on here? Or, don't you at least want some sauce to dip it in or something? If she were dead, I don't think I'd last more than 30 seconds before blowing a creamy load of useless sperm into the tight coldness of her. A tidal wave of white soldiers surging into the certainty of death unknown, searching frantically for something that no longer exists. The mere thought of it makes my dick stiffen a little. Complete arousal is rendered impossible by her beating heart and functioning lungs, contributing to a flushed liveliness in such stark contrast to the deadness of her eyes.
One day when he's at work, he kind of sees this midwife who looks towards a dead child in a suspicious way, so he follows her on the cameras and finds her down in the morgue herself. When he goes in, he discovers that she is sat naked, eating a baby, well, a fetus carcass, basically, on the floor. So this book covers their kind of journey together, discovering that there's more people that are into things like them, and her sort of obsession over this man.
Another horror novel which has been praised widely in horror fan groups is Gone to See the Riverman, authored by Christopher Triana. It follows Lori, a middle-aged woman who is obsessed with serial killer Edmund Cox. When he asks her to return a key to a mysterious figure known as the Riverman, she reluctantly brings her intellectually stunted older sister, Abby, along. Her journey takes her to his childhood home in the small town of Killen, which is deep in Appalachia, and reminds her of the skeletons lingering in her own closet. Spoilers! She was jealous of her older sister as a teenager who had unknowingly gotten into a sexual relationship with Lori's crush. In an attempt to educate herself, she began raping her little brother under the threat of telling others that he was forcing her. As he wasted away from a reactionary eating disorder, Abby confronted her and Lori attempted to kill her. Instead, she left her sister disabled and settled herself with taking care of her for the rest of her life. One early passage from the text reads, "It was a dark mass, black with rot and dried blood, more skeleton than flesh. The body was so mutilated that she could barely identify it as human. It was the upper torso that gave it away. Despite the rigor mortis and purpled flesh, she could tell the woman had been young. Her black hair was draped with webbing, and spiders scurried for cover when the light hit them. The girl's cheeks were hole-punched by maggots, her yellowed teeth exposed beneath. Her breasts had been spread apart, the rib cage pulled open, and what remained of her innards had turned to tarry chunks and ropes of mummified flesh, peppered by flies and their oozing egg sacs. She had been split down the center, from the ribs to her vagina, and was propped up in the corner like a lost doll, one eye socket gleaming in the flashlight's beam, the other filled by gray meat housing a curling worm."
I finished reading Gone to See the Riverman by Christopher Triana in one sitting, and we need to talk about it. With this book only being 165 pages long, I was pleasantly surprised with how complex the characters were, and also how, deep and interesting the lore of the whole story was. Now, let me tell you, I did think that I had the book figured out pretty early on, and man, did it go in some directions that I was not expecting it to go. And it really explored some themes that I did not see coming. That being said, there are some very graphic and brutal descriptions of violence and sexual acts in this book, so proceed with caution if need be.
Now, whether you like these books is going to depend on personal taste. Personally, they did the job and horrified me. However, I can recommend Gone to See the Riverman and its sequel far more liberally than I can Dead Inside, because despite commonalities in terms of subject matter, Triana manages to only describe sex acts enough to disgust you with them, while Morrison revels in how much detail he can add before you find yourself feeling sick, or worse, aroused. Both of these books could be described as obscene. But what exactly makes something obscene? Defined by Oxford Languages, it refers to material which is offensive or disgusting by accepted standards of morality and decency, or offending against moral principles, repugnant. Of course, this is still vague enough to be defined individually, as what a person thinks is moral is subject to personal taste. For many, it's defined the same way that child sexual materials are. I'll know it if I see it. You don't have to resort to horror novels published on Amazon Books to find obscene literature. Lolita could be called the poster child of obscene. Although few would consider it as such today, and instead praise it for the skillful wordsmanship and unreliable narrator, it was originally published in 1955 by the French company Olympia Press, best known for pornography and later for publishing difficult texts. Initially, Lolita had little success. Even when copies were smuggled into England and it received good reviews, Nabokov faced hardships as the British Home Office ordered that all copies entering the country should be seized. In order to get the book published in England, publisher George Wittenfeld would have to take on the obscenity laws that made it difficult to import the book, and which had served as justification for preventing other controversial books from being published. As noted by Thomas Harding in How Obscenity Laws Nearly Stopped Nabokov's Lolita from Being Published. In the decades leading up to the proposed publication of Lolita, governments had frequently cited obscenity as the reason for preventing controversial books being published. In the United States, the Federal Anti-Obscenity Act of 1873 had been used to ban Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, John Cleland's Fanny Hill, Boccaccio's The Decameron, and Voltaire's Candide. In Britain, the legal test for obscenity derived from an 1868 case known as Regina v. Hicklin, in which a judge ruled that obscene material tended to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influence. In 1928, the British government had relied on the Hicklin case to ban Marguerite Radcliffe Hall's lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness. Opposition to the book was whipped up by the media, particularly the Sunday Express, whose editor wrote, "I would rather give a healthy boy or a healthy girl a phial of prussic acid than this novel." That same year, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover was also deemed to violate the obscenity laws and was commercially published in only an expurgated version. 6 years later, the publisher Boris Wood was prosecuted for obscene libel and severely fined for releasing Boy, a sexually explicit novel by James Hanley. George's partner, Nigel Nicholson, defended Lolita by arguing that art could be obscene and that obscenity didn't negate creative value. He wrote, "Lolita deals with perversion. It describes the love of a middle-aged man for a girl of 12. If this perversion had been depicted in such a way as to suggest to any reader of middle age, or for that matter any little girl, could she understand it, that the practices were pleasant and could lead to happiness, I should have had no hesitation in advising my colleagues that we ought not to publish this book. But, in fact, Lolita has a built-in condemnation of what it describes. It leads to utter misery, suicide, prison, murder, and great unhappiness, both to the man and to the little girl whom he seduces."
Hold up, I think we need to actually talk about the book Lolita, because unfortunately, due to movie adaptations, the original tone and context to the book have actually been a bit mistranslated. So Lolita is a book about an older man who decides to get with a woman in order to groom and essentially date her underage daughter. And that's really creepy, and the book doesn't try to pretend it's anything other than that. The book has the whole unreliable narrator theme, and the whole point is for the audience, the person reading, to feel really uncomfortable and to actually say, yeah, this is gross. The book wants you to find the actions of the main character repulsive. However, the movie adaptations of Lolita actually went a different direction and ended up aestheticizing and trying to glamorize this weird relationship, which is entirely inappropriate, which is where those heart sunglasses, red lipstick, and bathing suit icon come from.
Today, Lolita is regarded as a classic, and even though it centers on exploring an aspect of the human experience that many would prefer not to dwell on, it is art, and it does offer value. There is a reason why Lolita remains recommended as reading material or as a literary classic, while splatterpunk tends to remain a niche genre. Often, what is deemed obscene is based on the opinions of a select few rather than because of the actual harm it may perpetuate or cause.
Hey, Will? People want to know, what's obscenity?
Obscenity is unprotected speech. It's defined after years of jurisprudential back and forth. Obscenity is a three-part test. Got to be whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest, that is an unhealthy or morbid interest in sex, whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way hardcore sexual activity, and whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or social value. That's obscenity. It's not protected. It's a high bar because it has to be a high bar.
In part, this is tied to the interpretation of media by those who consume it. Certainly, there have been cases of predators using Lolita to groom young women into sexual relationships, but one can say the same of many pieces of media, most of which would not be called obscene simply because it can be used to cause harm. So, is obscenity merely unacceptable depictions of sex and sexuality? Even this is subject to change. Obscenity is defined by those who have societal power to determine what is normal and what isn't. The Well of Loneliness was called obscene because of the inclusion of homosexuality and the lesbian identity of the author. But even if the topic is one a person may not like, it would hardly be called obscene today. James Joyce's Ulysses was deemed obscene because of the inclusion of a masturbation scene. Lady Chatterley's Lover and Madame Bovary were considered obscene merely for the portrayal of adultery, while The God of Small Things led its author to a legal fight simply because she portrayed an intercaste and cross-religion sexual relationship. Perhaps a better delineation can be found by defining a related word, vulgar. To be vulgar is to lack sophistication or good taste. This can be purposeful and at times required for the purpose of conveying a message. However, often the explicitness with which certain topics are discussed can also bring in a third quality, fetishization. As a friend of mine aptly said, the difference between vulgarity and obscenity is a combination of intent, purpose, and how it's received, as well as intended audience. Lolita is not obscene or vulgar by today's standards, not only because of the presentation of child abuse, but because it is obvious that the intent is to elicit disgust, not arousal. Thus, a story can center on the obscene, and it can be vulgar, and remain a work of art which presents a message. However, there is still a line between a work which uses obscenity or vulgarity for communication, and one which relishes in eliciting arousal or fetishizing something. Sometimes the line is not so clear, but often the difference is determined by sex.
I am a drag queen, female impersonator, a woman. This is If You're a Drag Queen and You Know It. If you're a drag queen and you know it, strike a pose. If you're a drag queen and you know it, shake your bum. If you're a drag queen and you know it, shake your bum. If you're a drag queen and you know it, and you really want to show it, if you're a drag queen and you know it, shake your bum. Woo!
Normalize the bulge. We are normalizing the bulge. Women can have bulges, and that's okay. We're not gonna stare at their crotches while they're wearing their little shopping shorts at the mall.
So a few months ago, I got my cake pops removed. You might have seen the video. And I have finally decided that I want to turn my remaining cake pop stick into a donut.
Versus.
It's story time. Story time. Story time with Mama G.
Berserk is a dark fantasy which began as a manga in 1989 and has since been adapted in various anime. By September 2023, the Berserk manga had over 60 million copies in circulation, including digital versions, making it one of the best-selling manga series of all time. The expansive storytelling and detailed artwork is a large draw for the series, but it is also well known for its portrayal of violence, sexual or otherwise. In the early chapters, there are plenty of scenes which illustrate detailed gore, but one can also note how sexual assault of male characters such as Guts and Griffith are portrayed in far less detail, relying more on the imagination of the audience and subtle details to elicit disgust and horror from the audience. Contrast this to various scenes with female rape victims, including that of Casca, the female lead, and the details, posing, and amount of time dedicated to these scenes becomes voyeuristic. Her abuse does not need to be shown in detail to further the plot, and often serves no purpose at all but to further illustrate the brutality of the world Berserk is set in, which any reader would already be aware of. Compare this to Revolutionary Girl Utena, which also centers on darker themes of sexual abuse, patriarchy, and incest, amongst others. Nudity is used sparingly, and often sexual interactions are not shown on screen. When they are brief, and the contrast between the elements of a fairy tale aesthetic and the shock of bursts of violence only serves to make them more impactful. The juxtaposition of tones and genres can also be seen in Elfen Lied, especially in the 2004 anime where female nudity and graphic violence are common, and there are still common sexualized tropes of anime, but they're not excessive and are deployed meaningfully.
Okay, cry and start begging. If you don't, I'll make sure the puppy does the crying for you. That was dumb. Hey, kick the dog and teach her a lesson. No! This is way better than anything we could think of doing to her. Keep holding it down.
One only has to compare older films to modern blockbusters to see the difference in how sex and violence are portrayed. Bonnie and Clyde was considered violent and excessive at the time, but hardly anyone would bat an eye at it today. Is it because of shifting attitudes due to increased open-mindedness and a lifting of restrictions based on a narrow definition of morality? Or is it because obscenity has become normalized over the years, alongside more blatant glorification of sexuality and violence? In simpler terms, were those critics who were worried that allowing the public to access violent and sexual material would lead to moral degradation right? Possibly. The same people who claim that representation is important argue that media doesn't affect reality and still enjoy watching, playing, and listening to media that illustrates graphic violence, sexuality, or moral attitudes, actions, or beliefs. However, if having a black, trans, or gay character in a show is important to the mental health and identity formation of people in those groups, then why wouldn't the rampant sexual violence portrayed in media, often against women, also have an effect? As noted by Jane Brown in Mass Media Influences in Sexuality, media serves as important sources of cultural norms that young people interact with as they learn to express affection, love, and intimacy in ways consistent with their own values, and general social expectations and scripts about adolescent sexuality. The same phenomenon found in pornography, wherein more and more extreme and diverse content is needed to elicit the same response, may be found in regular media as well. Normalization of obscenity has led to redefinition of the word, and the acceptance of larger expressions of the human experience. Certainly, sadism, masochism, sex, and violence are nothing new to humanity, but the ability for younger people to access materials including them so easily is new, as well as the extent to which these concepts are integrated into everyday life. Although it is true that teens who are predisposed to be more sexual than their peers may be more likely to select sexual media content, Brown argues that social factors can also either delay or accelerate adolescent sexual development, such as social status aspirations, the progression of aromantic or non-romantic relationships, or other emotional needs. Adults can be, and are still not always, capable of critical examination of the media that they consume, but susceptibility for social influence decreases with age. Children 8 to 11 years old, young adolescents 12 to 14 years old, and mid-adolescents 15 to 18-year-olds all showed susceptibility to prosocial influence, while young adults 19 to 25 and adults 26 to 59 did not. Thus, perhaps the issue lies not in obscene material itself, but the widespread access to it, which allows children and teens to access them easily, widely, and with the belief that doing so offers social status or accurate information. Parents have an obligation to manage the media that their children consume and to contextualize it. But the internet makes this difficult, as younger people tend to be better at using the internet and understanding how to use it to their own advantage than older people are. However, writing off everything that is obscene or vulgar as inherently worthless and bad ignores that the definition of the word relies on a specific view of what is and isn't moral. Thus, the question, does it enact, glorify, or perpetuate harm, is more prudent than merely asking, is it sexual or violent? This, dear viewers, is where we part. I've wanted to talk about Lolita for a long time, as you may be able to tell. It's one of my favorite books. I went through, a weird period of reading like literature in high school and college, and I read The Well of Loneliness too, and I just remember like being so excited to read this lesbian book and this Lolita because wow, these are books that I'm not supposed to read, and then actually reading them, it was like, that's it? That's the bad book? I've read worse fan fiction. And honestly, I think that's part of the problem. Like, I can look at gore pretty fine. I work in a vet's office. I've seen some injuries. It doesn't bother me like it might someone who's not in the medical field or who's not been a horror fan. I don't think that a lot of horror really works for me because, if you grow up watching horror, then you kind of change what you consider to be horrifying. And on a societal level, we've been for generations and generations now playing violent games and watching violent and sexual media. And on one hand, I don't like the idea of, that somebody knows better than me. They're going to be paternalistic and tell me what I can and can't read or watch. I'm more intelligent than that. But certainly there should be some sort of restrictions, especially for people who are minors, children. There's a reason why you don't show sexual material to children, and it's because it is harmful. It's bad. Like, even just seeing sexualized content for young children can mess them up sexually years down the line. And that's what really gets on my nerves about, like, the arguments against, like, ID checks or for logging in for a Pornhub or something. You already have a bunch of information collected on you by Pornhub, so I don't know what your issue is. Secondly, what's the problem with proving that you're an actual adult when it will protect a lot of children from being harmed and harming other children? But instead, we end up focusing on, again, we always feel like I'm stuck with these same three arguments over stupid stuff. And so the public debate is on drag queens, which, yes, is a problem, but it's like a symptom of a larger problem. It's like you're got the cold and you're focusing on the sniffles instead of the entire cold. Anyhow, if you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can leave them in the comment section down below. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!